Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Fake news, bogus websites, deepfake interviews augmented by AI. We've all, often without our knowledge, fallen foul of this kind of manipulation, most of it coming from Russia. Tonight with our panel, we'll explore how and why this is happening and hopefully provide you with some ways to be more aware of what you're being exposed to online especially. Our guests are Vanina Paoli-Gagin, who's a French senator, one of the prime movers behind a proposed law to tackle Russian interference in France. Madame, thank you so much for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
On the other side of our plateau, but not necessarily against, Louis Bernard, specialist in cybercrime and terrorism, founder of Cruisertech. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
In Vilnius, in Lithuania, Alexandra Filipenko, political analyst, frequent guest here on France 24. Alexandra, always a pleasure to see you too. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And in Berlin, Nick Holdsworth, France 24's former Moscow correspondent, a man who has a genuine insight into what is happening across in Eastern Europe. Nick, great to see you. Before we hear from our panelists, let's set the scene. Russia targeting the Paris Olympics, spreading fake news and propaganda online. The aim is to try to sabotage the Games by putting people off making the trip to see the spectacle. A study by Microsoft homed in on Russia's use of, among other things, a Tom Cruise impersonation, fake press releases, and even a bogus video report purporting to be from our own channel, France 24. Cami Knight with this.
With less than 2 months to go until the 2024 Olympics kick off, Russia is ramping up efforts to scare people away from the Paris Games. A Microsoft report has shown the lengths Russian propagandists are going to sow fears of terrorism. Russia is banned from the Olympics because of its invasion of Ukraine. And since June of 2023, Russian influence actors known as Storm 1679 and Storm 1099 have pivoted their focus to the Games, Microsoft pointing to two principal aims: denigrating the reputation of the IOC and creating the expectation of violence breaking out in Paris. One stunt has involved using artificial intelligence to impersonate actor Tom Cruise's voice, narrating a fake documentary disparaging the IOC leadership. Other deceptive videos have also been disseminated online, one claiming to come from France 24, saying 24% of tickets for the Games had been returned due to fears of terrorism. Or this fake press release warning the public of possible terror attacks. Other images and videos reference the 1972 Munich Olympics, where members of militant group Black September killed 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team and a police officer. Microsoft expects this kind of activity to intensify as the date for the opening ceremony draws nearer.
Cami Knight with that scene setter for our debate. Let's bring in first Vanina Paoli-Gagin, French senator, one of the movers behind the law to tackle Russian interference in France, and of course, by extension, elsewhere. Madam, thanks for being with us. Can you give us an update on where we are with this law? Where are we up to right now?
Okay, first of all, I would like to say that plagiarizing Napoleon, I would say that what prevails with the truth is not to be true, but to be believed. And I think that the Russian power is key power in this propaganda art, really. What we did, we have voted yesterday on our law proposal, which gives our administrative and judicial power a kind of toolbox to start by creating a registre des activités d'influence étrangère, which is a foreign influence register, with authorizing intelligence services to use algorithm in order to prevent and to detect, such as what we have for terrorism matters. And we have voted for capacity to freeze assets of personal, individual, physical persons, as well as enterprises or big companies, making interferences. That's what we have voted, and now it has to be voted, I think, tonight in the National Assembly, if I'm correct. That's, on a legal point of view, where we are in the lawmaking process.
French senator and lawyer Pauli Degagin, thank you for giving us that update on that. We'll get back to you very shortly. Louis Bernard, just sitting opposite, with your head, which is dealing with crisis management, but also looking at how these things happen and how they affect people. Clearly, that must be a good start, but there must be many more things that need to be done in order to stop the kind of things that we're seeing. For instance, the bogus report from France 24, purporting to be from France 24, citing 24% of seats not sold or whatever, which is, we're France 24. Isn't that just too good to be true, that 24 and 24? I don't know, there are so many aspects about this.
Yes.
What is your feeling?
Well, first of all, stopping it, I think, is an illusion. You would always have people trying to create rumors or play up a little thing to make it a big thing. For example, something is happening on the streets in Paris, and you've got a million people online playing it up so that it's bigger than expected. So stopping it is going to be really hard. So I think the best defense really would be. I'll call it intellectual self-defense for the people really not to play along with it. And it's really a question of internet hygiene in a way. Where did I get this information from? Who passed it on to me? Has it been verified by the proper media and that kind of thing? And this is why it's all those attacks are evolving a little bit. I mean, pretending to be France 24 is actually a pretty clever tool if you think about it, because now we know that more and more people online try to verify information, and so that's why this kind of attackers try to appear as legit as possible. And the technology here is evolving tremendously. We've heard the voice of actor Tom Cruise. We've had the voice of Joe Biden, which of course has been replicated perfectly because we have so much of his voice, available for replication. So we'll have to be very, very, very defend ourselves and always be very, very precise on how an information is being shared, which is of course very hard because of the speed of it.
And of course, doing what they're doing to try to target the Olympics creates, Madame, in people's minds, a sense of confusion. People might think, is this something that the government is concerned about? That people might feel that they should cancel their trip to Paris because of things that they are reading.
For sure, but I strongly agree with what was said. The best defense is to believe in your democratic value and to be a cyber citizen in a way. I mean, all the citizens must be like shields against this kind of false, fake, distorted information. But we have to use technical devices too, especially the medias. I'm thinking, for example, of the originator profile in Japan, or several tools or devices like that. I think it will be mandatory for free medias to be very strong in using this kind of technology, and we have to be very strong in educating our kids at school very early to be able to have their critical analysis, critical spirit, in order to not to believe what they see, because now it's almost by watching TV or news on the social medias or internet that they get the information.
So we have to tell our children, reinforce in their minds that they must question everything they see on TV, on the radio, online, everywhere.
I mean, they have to be educated too, but the information has to be traceable, to be tagged, to be verified, to be checked by technological means, as I said previously.
Traceable, tagged, verified, three good words to add to this debate. Let's bring in our guests from afar. In Vilnius, we've got Alexandra Filipenko, political analyst in Berlin, Nick Holdsworth, France 24's former correspondent in Moscow. I hope you've been hearing what's been said here in the studio. I'm desperate to get your views. Excuse me, Alexandra, excuse me. Give us your sense of the situation, because clearly you may have lived firsthand the type of things that we're actually feeling right now.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I think that now we see that Russian threat is credible and it is in the air. And more and more time, many times actually, after the full-scale invasion, European intelligence agencies have warned their governments that Russia is planning violent acts of sabotage. And we've seen those acts of sabotage. And of course, now the aim is the Olympics. This is the main target right now. The main goal is to divide Europeans, and that means dividing Ukraine's allies also, and disrupt military assistance to Kiev and disrupt help to Ukraine. So intelligence officials all around Europe have increasingly been vocal about the threats from Russia, and Putin is stepping up. Russia is definitely stepping up, and as we know, as I know personally, I used to be an opposition activist in Russia since 2012, and I know so well that Moscow is a master. It mastered hybrid warfare. It mastered those tactics. And now, unfortunately, Western governments have to deal with it. Unfortunately, Western countries should turn to those 1920 tactics of Europe, of European governments, to respond to those Russian attacks, because these are attacks and sabotage campaigns, the same ones, or at least they can be compared to those of the Soviet security services in 1920s. And since I've been living in Moscow all my life, and I was also targeted by the security services in Russia, we always had those three steps, three tactics for dealing with such threats, for disinformation threats, fake news threats. First of all, we need to recognize that these attacks are happening and warn of them. And that is what we are doing now here at France 24. The next step is to build resilience, to strengthen the critical infrastructure, to teach the children again, and in this case, to build national resilience, national infrastructure to talk about these cases. And then a response, but of course, not the illegal response, not to go to those means that Russia is using, but there needs to be some kind of response, because otherwise Moscow will not stop.
Alexandra, bear with us, please. I'm going to bring in Nick Holdsworth, former France 24 correspondent in Moscow. Nick, thanks for being with us. You know the format. I'll allow you to talk about any point you want, but I'll start by asking you, how tough was your job in Moscow?
It was pretty tough to get information at times. It was pretty tough, particularly as we headed towards the start of Russia's attack on Ukraine in February 2022. It was pretty hard to gauge how to talk about things, because one was aware that the laws were tightening up, that the Russian state, the Kremlin, wasn't going to be looking kindly upon journalists and reporters who were too critical. In terms of the sort of mis and disinformation, that was always just part of the game, really. We never really took at face value anything that the Russian government said, and relied upon our own sources, talking to people at all different levels, certainly talking to officials, talking to senior KGB people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, and then talking to commentators, sociologists, analysts, political commentators, people from different think tanks, but always doing a lot of research around, who are those people? What's their background in that think tank? Are they pro-Kremlin, or are they pretending to be more independent? I'm sure Alexandra will relate to a lot of this.
Question of double things. Let's go back to our guest in Lithuania, Alexandra Filipenko. Picking up the back of what Nick was just saying there, Alexandra, that sense of double speak, of double think, it sounds very Orwellian, George Orwell, but a reality if you're brought up in Russia.
Of course, this has always been there. There's always been present in Russia, and we knew how to deal with such threats. This is why I think it's so important to talk to Europeans that have to deal with these threats after the full-scale invasion, especially after the full-scale invasion. But it's always been there. This danger has always been there. And this is how the Russian security services work, actually. They need to muddy the waters. And in those those muddy waters, that's the only way how they operate. Their key is to intimidate people. And there is actually nothing new in their tactics, just divide and conquer. This is their main objective. And now we know that Russia, in the past few months, I think the report was on 2023, Financial Times reported that Russia has spent millions of euros on propaganda in 48 countries of the European Union and also around the world. And it spends so much money on propaganda. And recently, Czech Republic sanctioned one of the relatives of Vladimir Putin because according to the Czech Special Services, a large network of Russian propaganda and influence campaign was launched in the EU. It was launched by Viktor Medvedchuk, who used to be a Ukrainian politician. He is behind the creation of the whole network, and he used his network to influence not only Czech Republic, but also the European Union. It was this news portal, Voice of Europe. So, of course, Russian propaganda, and Russia is using the same tactics it's been using inside the country, that it mastered them amazingly. It mastered them, and now they're using the same tactics in the European Union and around the world. And of course, they will continue doing it, because they will continue doing it while the war lasts, and they will continue doing it while there is this divide between Russia and the collective West, as Moscow is calling the European countries, the United States, and the whole world that does not support Russia right now.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. It's fascinating to hear your take on this, the fact that you've lived through it all, worked through it all, and it's forced you to leave your hometown of Moscow. Let me just add something to the mix here. French police have arrested a 26-year-old man of Ukrainian and Russian nationality in possession of explosives. This in a hotel north of Paris. This is coming from Paris prosecutors. The source of the French PNAT Anti-Terrorism Prosecutor's Office said that they've taken charge of the case. They've opened an investigation on suspicion of participation in a terrorist conspiracy. The source said that France's domestic spy agency is handling the investigation. This is clearly a disturbing development. Louis?
Yeah, one thing about the price of it. We know that Russia and Russian oligarchs are spending millions on propaganda. And sometimes it doesn't have to be very expensive. It doesn't have to be very elaborate. As you know, as everybody knows, in France there have been a lot of demonstrations on the war on Gaza. Some of it pure pro-Palestinian, some of it a little anti-Zionist, some of it pure anti-Semitic. And a way to play up the divides that happen on French campuses in France was actually very easily done just by paying 4 people to overnight draw David stars on different walls in France, and then a few days after, those bloodied hands on the Shoah memorial in Paris. Very, very easy to do, very not elaborate at all, not completely inexpensive, and fueling up the debate, fueling up the divides in our democracy. So we have to be collectively stronger than this, because a lot of money is spent on propaganda, and sometimes it doesn't need to be very expensive to have damaging effects.
So the Stars of David in blue
Yes.
put on houses in an area in Paris which
Pure
is
fabrication.
purely supposed to be where Jewish people are living, but that was a fabrication, as you said.
Absolutely.
The red hands, which is meant to be indicative of something against Jewish people, killing Jewish people.
Absolutely.
Those hands were printed onto the Shoah Memorial in Paris. And then the coffins.
And then the coffins in front of the Eiffel
Planted
Tower.
by the Eiffel Tower with French flags on them, with the inscription on it, French soldiers in Ukraine. Madame Senator, Vanina Paulini-Gagin, this is clearly, as Louis says, it doesn't cost a great deal of money to do this, but it's a very effective way of pointing at, attacking the French state.
I agree. I think that times they are changing regarding what informational war is. And we are in this situation nowadays. So, as you said, we won't stop this propaganda trend, which is, I think, in the DNA of this kind of countries, okay? we have to be aware, we have to make statements, we have to build technical, legal infrastructure to struggle against this threat. But I think, again, that the strongest shield will be education and cyber. Don't forget it. Cyber has risen from counterculture. I think we have to do the same thing. We have to reverse engineer what's going on, and it's with art, culture, education that we will be stronger to fight against what's finally nothing.
Yeah, okay. So how important, madam, is it that channels like ours, France 24, debate this issue, talk about this issue, and continue to present and analyse and with great integrity, do journalism properly? How important is that?
It's vital. I mean, you are one of the pillars of what I'm saying, because the information has to be sure, to be true, to be believed.
Thank you, madam, for giving us that endorsement, because clearly we here at France 24 try to give the news straight down the line, regardless of anybody's political position, but tell the facts as they are. Let's bring back in someone who does that for us on a regular basis, Nick Holdsworth, our correspondent, formerly in Moscow, now based in Berlin. Nick, the situation for you, for me, for every journalist involved today is that you need to get past a couple of obstacles before you tell a story, before someone actually believes what you're saying. You've got to be incredibly convincing, and you've got to make sure that you're totally correct, because we can't afford the slightest error, can we?
No, we can't indeed, because people do rely upon us, and that is why it's so dangerous, and the Russians know what they're doing, creating false narratives, false video clips claiming to be from France 24. But they're experts at this, and they've been doing this for a long time. Alexandra referred earlier to the Russian Secret Services doing this in the 1920s, which is absolutely true. 100 years ago, there was a so-called Zinoviev letter, which was some kind of letter revealing some kind of plot which did a lot of damage to British politics at the time, and the party which the Russians wanted to win that election won. I can't remember the exact details now, but much more recently than that, and Alexander will remember this, just 10 years ago, Russian TV producer Peter Pomerantsev, wrote this great book called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and he exposed this whole culture of creating fake news in Russia, in the media at that time. It was mostly just in Russia at that time, and the Russian state has kind of perfected this idea that question everything, which I think is a slogan that Russia Today, RT, the propaganda mouthpiece of the Kremlin, uses. And their idea is, by questioning everything, they don't mean question what isn't right. They mean question established facts as well, to the point that you can lie through your teeth and say, well, prove us wrong, kind of thing. Go and prove that President Biden is speaking the truth, or that President Macron is speaking the truth. Disprove that we're not. So they've really worked very hard at this, and to produce the material they're doing at the moment alongside apparently these other incidents, the coffins, the Stars of David, the red hands on a Jewish cemetery or Jewish neighborhood. This is all part of a policy to seed doubt and to seed an insecurity in the value and the efficacy and the veracity of information that we receive over public channels. If you look across Europe, public channels in Britain, the BBC, in France, the French channels, including France 24, they've all been questioned in recent years as if they don't have an established history of getting the facts straight. And this is one of the key directions of the so-called hybrid warfare of the Kremlin that is being waged actively in Europe at the moment.
You mentioned, Nick, just staying with you for a moment, you mentioned that infamous letter in the 1920s which scuppered the chances of the Labour Party at the time of forming a government. It was tipped that would happen. And there was questions about who led led to this being published in the Daily Mail. But clearly that was one of the things. Do you think the way that the media in the West has developed in the years after that has played into the hands of Russia, to Russia, the hands of Russia, in what it is trying to do now? The sensationalism, the bending of facts that some newspapers do, like The Sun, for instance, in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Russia has been pumping out extraordinary sensationalist stories that mix just enough fact and reality into them to be believable, but with plenty of lies into the bargain. And the KGB, the FSB, whatever you want to call the Russian security services, they play a long game. And this has been developed over decades. And really nothing much has changed since Soviet times, only that they've become more sophisticated and they have far more sophisticated tools at their disposal, including increasingly sophisticated AI, which means that you can put up images, put up voices, manipulate things. It's very hard to tell the difference. Just a couple of years ago, after the Bucha massacre, Russian TV that evening got images out purported to show corpses lying in the street getting up after a truck with cameras in had passed them. And it was bad, it was amateur, it was done in a rush. They won't be caught out like that again. They're very slick these days.
So you're saying that what we're going to see in future is an increasing manipulation of the reality, and that is a very scary idea. Nick, thank you. Let me bring in one of the wisest men I know, Louis Bernard, who is able to give people advice about handling crisis and obviously deal with issues like cybercrime. And this is what we're looking at here, Louis, this development that Nick is warning about. How do we begin to prepare ourselves for that as consumers of news, as producers of news? How do we begin to sort of deal with that?
Check the facts. Sometimes I'm surprised how easily corrected those fake news are. I mean, I, for one, would love for a quarter of the Olympic tickets to be back on the market because I'll take advantage of it. So I'll just have to look it up to see that's, they're fully booked and good for us. And that no one is not coming to the Olympics because of that. So sometimes really what you want to do is common sense, is really asking everything. For companies, for institution, you want to be a bit more precise than that and preparing yourselves for the instance of an AI-generated narrative being thrown against you and that kind of thing. So what we do, for example, are exercises in order to see, that happens, that might be on your radar, that might be in your next crisis, and you have to understand how it works in order to be as prepared as possible to answer quickly.
Reporters on our French channel, for instance, have been a victim of this, that there have actually been things have been produced purporting to be something that went out on our French channel. Of course, it wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But it looked very convincing. This is the problem.
Very convincing. Yeah, absolutely. And the technology is much better now than it was a few years ago. I mean, I can easily produce tonight for, I don't know, maybe $20, a convincing video clip of President Macron saying something completely unacceptable on the fields at the Colville Memorial.
Up in Saint-Lô, for instance. Yeah.
Up in Saint-Lô, exactly. Because I've got all the contest images, I've got enough footage of President Macron to make something believable, and it's really a question of time to put to it. So really to question everything in a good sense, to see really where the information is coming from, and to be ready to respond. What is interesting in this new legislation is that France is giving itself the means to respond. We now have an old agency that is looking at all those fake news, Viginium, and is not shying away from publicizing how it works and the logistics of it. And this is taking more and more traction in France. And really the time of being naive is behind us. And I like the response of the authorities very much.
Madam Senator, the time of being naive is behind us.
It's over, yes, for sure. And I think we are on a test and learn path because it's a new situation. But I think that we have to get accustomed to a kind of procedural approach of what information is. As you said, you have to double check, you have to have a kind of reflex, eliminating what is fake, what is true, because what's at stake is really, I think, undermining the trust. And once you have undermined the trust of people, everything is possible. Every fantasy is possible. That's the real threat and the real danger, I think.
Madam, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring back in from Vilnius, Lithuania, Alexandra Filipenko, political analyst, born and raised in Moscow, now living abroad because of the situation. Alexandra, you've been listening to what's been said. Can I start you off on this next section by saying, you know, we can talk about the interference to try to sabotage the Paris Olympics. We could talk about interference in French elections, interference in British elections, interference in the Brexit referendum. We can talk about interference in the US presidential election, and no doubt in the presidential election to come. The one thing that is certain is that these things will keep happening, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes, they will keep happening as far as we know, and as far as what I can say about my experience with the Russian special services. And I don't talk only about myself, about all opposition activists that I know of. They will not stop. And it is very important, really, to understand that there is evidence of more aggressive tactics, more coordinated tactics all around Europe and in the United States. And for example, just yesterday, posters calling for French military in Ukraine to surrender appeared right next to French embassy in Moscow. Those posters are hanging, and I think Nick knows this place at Bolshaya Yakimanka Street. This is that's the main public transportation stop where the French embassy is, where it is located. And so those posters are showing the commander of the SS division and French national, Edgar Poe, and he was killed by the Soviets in 1945, and it calls for French to surrender in Ukraine. Of course, we can understand that there are no French military in Russia, obviously, not in Moscow, that's for sure. And why are they putting those posters there? It's a sign. It's a sign for France because it's put up by the French embassy, and it's a sign for the French-speaking world. It's a sign for the Kremlin, the obvious sign that Moscow will move forward. The Moscow will not stop. This is actually the danger, and it is very important, and it is needed to realize that Russia is devoting more resources to it and stepping up tactics, and the credible threat, there is this credible threat. So it is time to raise awareness and focus on this situation, because Moscow is, and KGB mainly, FSB, not Moscow in general, not Russian people, but the governmental officials, the KGB, they will not stop if they are not stopped. Of course, the tactics cannot be illegal. Of course, we all understand that, because it's Russia who goes to the illegal tactics. And for example, Pegasus spyware, just recently, again, Pegasus spyware was found on the devices of Russian opposition journalists and activists in Europe and in the Baltic states and Lithuania, where I am. Pegasus gives full access to contents of the phone, including messages and even encrypted correspondence. First, it was found in 2020, and Russian KGB, Russian FSB is continuing to use it. And no one knows if there is this Pegasus spyware on other journalists' phones. We know it in Russian opposition journalists' phones, but maybe also in European journalists' phones. There is no way to find out. And of course, Moscow wants to interfere in European elections. It wants to buy politicians, and it's been trying to do it for past many, many years. Surely it will not stop now during the war with Ukraine.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. That incident you talked about, the posters being put up outside the French embassy in Moscow, it actually comes at the same time as Sergei Lavrov has said that French soldiers who are on training missions in Ukraine are now, as he puts it, fair game, legitimate targets. So clearly there's something very sinister in those two things being put together. You talk about Russia trying to buy out politicians. It's worth pointing out that the far-right National Front, as it was, National Rally, as it's now called here in France, did have a big loan with a bank very loyal to Vladimir Putin. That loan, some 6 million or more euros, as I understand it, has been paid back. So we're clarifying that one. But there you go, Russia using its influence in some way, shape or form to be heard on some level or another, politically perhaps, in that situation. Volodymyr Zelensky, he's expected in Paris on Friday. He'll meet with his French counterpart. Then the Ukrainian president will address the Assemblée Nationale. Zelensky continues himself to be the victim of Russian fake news stunts regarding his personal wealth. His wife, Olena, has also been targeted. All have been exposed as bogus, these fake news items about them. Bogus and, of course, originating from Russia to undermine both Ukrainian and Western faith in Zelensky and resistance to the Russian invasion. The thing is, Madam Senator, Vanina Paolini-Gagin, when Zelensky comes to Paris, it's important for him that people look at him and believe him. But it's also important that people outside, not just the politicians, but the people outside, they believe him and know he is speaking the truth. It's very important.
Yes, it's essential.
And Russia's trying to undermine this all the time.
Yes, we have to fight against this distortion of the truth. And I think that it's highly a symbol that President Zelensky comes back for this special period of our common European history. It has weight, and maybe it will wake up something in the mind of our citizens. I hope so.
Nick, can I bring you back in to have more comments about the posters being hung up outside the embassy? That kind of thing. How will that play with people in the street, you think? What will they make of it?
I think it would just reinforce the message, which is omnipotent in Russia now, that this is not a war started by the Russians against the Ukrainians. This is a war started by the West against Russia. The whole narrative there is that the Russians are the victims, and these sorts of posters underline that. And just to come back to the earlier point about political influence, the Russians have been playing this game of political influence for a long time. I mean, in the UK, we have a Russian who's the son of a trained KGB officer, that son is now a member of the British House of Lords, personal friend of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. His father, and I'm not saying that the son's an agent, but his father definitely was a KGB agent, brought a British newspaper, and his father had trained with an old KGB chap that I knew in Moscow, and this friend of mine in Moscow told me all about his time in London when he was the correspondent for Soviet Popular Mechanics and spent a lot of time in the bars in Westminster, just about the same time when I was working as a correspondent in Westminster, coincidentally. Never met him at the time. This has been going on for years and years. So on the one hand, you have these domestic messages, those posters put up on Bolshoi Yakimanskaya next to the French embassy, which, as Alexander said, is a major thoroughfare, gets lots of attention, lots of people travelling up and down on that road. That message will get out in Russia. And at the same time, there's this continual effort to undermine. And it's not just the far right. As I've just said, in the UK, we have in the House of Lords the son of a Soviet-trained KGB agent who was also working in London at one point, I understand,
Indeed.
as an undercover embassy employee.
Talking London, I'm thinking now Chelsea FC, I'm thinking sports clubs, I'm thinking that kind of involvement, that sort of soft power kind of infiltration now is over because of the Ukraine war.
Yep.
But nonetheless, that influence has been there
Yep.
for many, many, many years, and this is what's really been the insidious thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact is that in the financial centres in London, in Frankfurt, in Paris, we Europeans, we took the Russian money. There was so much money sloshing around. It was a great ride. And there were voices warning about this at the time, warning about the connections between people like Roman Abramovich and others who bought football clubs, who splashed their money around. There were voices warning about that. 10 years ago, nobody's bothered because the money taps are wide open. And the Russian state's very good at using the wealth of its people, poor beleaguered Russians, in this way. And I mean, this is something which I'm sure Alexander will agree with, is that sometimes it's very easy to cast Russia as a whole a lot of the people there may not be thinking very critically at the moment. It's very difficult. But I was talking to a friend the other day. I said, she's in Moscow very often, Russian woman. I said, how is it there at the moment? And she said, on the surface, everything looks normal, but underneath there's a lot of fear and loathing. So, you know, we have a regime which has really got its grips into that society. And I saw that since Vladimir Putin came into power right at the end of 1999. Very early on, he shut down independent TV. They took control of the means of communication as soon as they could, and they've just tightened the control ever since.
Reinforcing what our senator here, Vanina Paoli-Gagin, was saying about the need to have independent media doing proper, thorough journalism, getting the truth out, telling the truth fearlessly, because that's the important thing, because sometimes people don't want to hear the truth, but it's important to say that truth. That's the important thing. And that's, I suppose, the lesson that we should be teaching everybody from very small, that they should look for that truth, and they should look to make sure that what is being said has a source, a traceable source, and they can actually find out that this is the real truth. That's the important thing, isn't it?
That's very important. And I think that one thing as more important is the place we leave to science in our societies. Yeah. It's very seldom that we have scientists on TV, for example. True. And it's very important to have this kind of persons who are very smart in their field, explaining what is sure, what is certain, and what is a discovery to make. Because we have to doubt. It's human nature to doubt. But we have to have minimum common ground on what is true, what is not true. Otherwise, we cannot be societies anymore.
And if I may add to this, it's not only a piece of news like, I don't know, Volodymyr Zelensky is a Nazi. It's the way lies are being repeated and repeated all over again. This narrative that Russia is only responding to a Western attack and not attacking itself. I mean, this has been ingrained not only in the far right or in the far left in France, but with many people. Where in France, we can absolutely say that a former president and a former prime minister are very much saying exactly the same thing, that Russia is answering or responding to Western attacks rather than attacking itself. And the way it is ingrained, it's not only posted being put up or something happening in the media. It's a long-term process, and the long-term process is building narratives. So the most famous one, of course, is Russia is the victim and is only responding to Western interference. And you have others. France is a divided country is another one. There is a civil war in France bound to happen in a day or two. Those kind of narratives take a long time. And some people sometimes don't know that they are part of this big project because they are just retweeting something or re-saying something that they've heard. But it's a multipolar project, if you like.
Alexandra Filipenko, the final word in this debate goes to you. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that it's very important to just say that something is clearly going on. And it's been already said that Moscow mastered hybrid warfare and covering its tactics. And the problem, of course, it remains that Russian propaganda attacks or any other kind of attacks are in the gray zone. They're unpredictable. They are asymmetric. They can take different forms. And it is extremely important to stay aware. It is extremely important to really look into the facts and really understand and go to the facts, because Russian security services are definitely working, and they're working in the French-speaking world, absolutely for sure. This is one of the main goals, to divide and conquer, and just to say that there is something there, to plant this idea into people's minds, maybe like in Christopher Nolan's movies, to plant this idea that there is something, Russia can be right, and no one goes to the facts. So it's very important to go exactly to the facts.
Alexandra Filipenko, thank you very much for joining us. Nick Holdsworth in Berlin too. Thank you, sir, as always. Thank you to Louis Bernard of Cruiser Tech here in the studio, and thanks to the French Senator Vanina Pauline Gagin, for sharing your analysis and telling us what France is doing on a legal level to try to stop what is happening. The facts as we know them, the Olympics will take place. France is a democracy. People disagree and argue. It's allowed. It's a good, healthy thing. And we at France 24 will do our very best to give you the news as it happens, when it happens, with all the facts straight in a line. Thank you for joining us here on The Debate. Stay with us.